Hey there, my name is Alex. I am the Silver Mont, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at Rise of the Ronin, which released last year on PlayStation and recently came out on PC. Disclaimer time, I received a review copy for this title as a Steam key. Rise of the Ronin is a new game from Koei Tecmo and Team Ninja, following in the footsteps of Nioh and Wulong. If you've played either of those games, you will have a pretty good idea of what to expect. The big shift here is that Rise of the Ronin is an open world game, the developer's first, in fact, and in that aspect it plays a little like recent Assassin's Creed games. Each part of the map is divided into segments, which you might think of as provinces, each of which has its own mini-objectives and collectibles that you can partake in, if you so choose. There's also side missions around the world, and all of this is outside of the main story, which takes place in 1850s Japan. We'll touch more on that in a moment. First up, gameplay. What sets Rise of the Ronin apart from, say, Assassin's Creed and Ghost of Tsushima and other games you might compare it with would be the combat. Whilst it isn't as complex or as good as Nioh 2, and in some ways is a bit more like Wulong with an emphasis on parries, countersparks as they're called in this game, it's still a lot better than any ass Creed game. I've never played Ghost of Tsushima, but the combat looked a little bit iffy, if serviceable, in that game. Rise of the Ronin may fall behind in other areas, but I think the combat, something you do most of the time, gives it the edge. To that effect, you have a lot of weapons in Rise of the Ronin. Katana, paired katana, spear, naginata, great sword of both Japanese and Western kinds, bayonets, Chinese dao, and a bunch of ranged weapons. You can unlock additional styles for each of these weapons and then equip 3 at a time and swap between them. Sort of like if you picked which stances you wanted in Nioh. Instead of high, medium and low, you pick different schools of swordsmanship, for example. It's similar in principle. This game also keeps the same loot system, more or less, as those other titles. You'll get hundreds of items and sift through them for upgrades. Feels a little smoother in Rise of the Ronin, a little more refined, with filters and easy to tell at a glance which is an upgrade. There's also a pretty damn good glamour, transmog, layered armor, fashion system for changing the appearance of your items, which is always nice. As for development, you'll get a skill tree for each of your stats, strength, dex, intelligence, charm, and so on. Combat is sort of a simplified hybrid of Wulong and Nioh. A large part of the game involves using the countersparks to parry enemies and break their posture, allowing you to get a critical. But it's important not to be too passive, as you can obviously attack between waiting for parries. However, with the enemy having such extreme hyper armor, until you panic them, sometimes it is tempting to just wait it out and rely solely on parries almost. I think Nioh 2 is still the best in this instance with these sorts of games when it comes to combat, but Rise of the Ronin is certainly not bad, and there's plenty of room to pull off cool things once you get used to the combat. Not featured here because A, I suck, B, most of these clips are relatively early on whilst I was still figuring out which weapons I wanted to use, which styles were good for what. The game's story, though, takes place during Bakumatsu, the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. Foreign powers are encroaching upon Japan, desiring free trade with the rest of the world. But the island nation has been in a state of isolation for 200 years or something like that. If you know Nioh, that game saw the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, and here we see its end, some generations later. Likewise, if you've ever watched Gintama, well, that's kind of like a highly fictionalized premise of the same kind of characters, like variations of them. You can expect to see the historical versions of Katsura and the Shinsengumi gorilla, for example. I bring these up as they're common examples that people who aren't specifically into that setting might recognize just from Gintama and Nioh being popular. The story isn't bad, but I'm not sure how appealing it'll be for people unless they already have an interest in that area of history, Personally, I think it's a decent story, quite a good one at times. You will essentially choose between pro and anti-shogunate forces as you play through, meeting and bonding with many characters. The game has quite a lot of small systems too, collecting, sending out cats on missions, as you do, the bond system to develop relationships with other characters in exchange for rewards. along with all the side objectives in the open world, and the combat and, getting new gear. But combat is the most fleshed out part for sure, and also the best part of the game, along with the story. The open world itself is fine. It's not super thrilling, it's not exciting. If you have an interest in 19th century Japan, then you'll get more out of walking around Yokohama and other settlements than someone who isn't. Outside of the city, the countryside is, well, it's countryside. Hills, mountains, fields. It's not like fantasy landscapes like Elden Ring. The open world is kind of bland and not exciting. Does the game benefit from being open world? I don't know. Traversal is easy, you can go from gliding to horseback and just running with infinite stamina. It doesn't actively take away from the game experience like, say, Dynasty Warriors 9, but does it make the game better for being open world? I don't think so. For one thing, it means that multiplayer is trimmed down some. There is co-op, but only for story missions. Open world exploration is not able to be done in co-op, which is a huge shame and would have made the game a lot more enjoyable if you ask me. It's especially odd, as you can even make two characters at the start of the game, which makes you feel like, oh, is this going to be like some sort of co-op thing? It's not, because the other one kind of waddles off for story reasons. The open world is a bit pointless, but not offensively so. Whilst it doesn't actively detract from the game, I'm not sure if it's improved the game for being there. You can largely ignore it at least and just go through the story if you want to. I'd rather have a game like Nioh 2, fully co-opable with more focus levels. How about the game's graphics and performance? Well, this isn't a great looking game. It looks decent at times, when you're out in the fields generally, and a lot of that's carried by kind of the just art direction. In the towns, looks kind of rough, and that's where performance becomes an issue. Outside of cities, I pretty much maintain 60 FPS almost entirely. You can set the game higher than 60 FPS. As is usually the case for me, I lock a majority of the games I plan on making videos for to 60 FPS. One could make a good case for not doing so with this game, because parry timing, well, when you need precise timing, precise aiming, the more frames you have, the better. So I could definitely see a case for this game to unlock the frame rate, or lock it at like 120. In the cities, I had it dropped down to low 40s, I would say was the worst. I've seen a lot of people complaining about the performance in the comments on Steam and stuff, so I can believe it. It's not been awful for me, but it's not been good either. I think the game has frame generation, but I haven't even turned it on, and I wouldn't really suggest turning it on for a game like this, but you could do, it's an option, it's there. Something about the city seems like it needs further work. Whilst the cities should be the highlight, I kind of feel like I want to avoid them, because they look worse than the rest of the game, and they run kind of bad too. It's not ideal. Given the game's kind of outdated visuals in general, it's a shame it doesn't perform better in these locations. So the game's sore points would be the open world being a tad boring, and the diminished co-op for me, and the performance in towns. The strong points would be the combat and the story. Overall, I suppose you need to ask yourself, what do you want out of your open world samurai game? Do you want overall quality? Then Ghost of Tsushima is probably the way to go for an even experience. Do you want great combat? Rise of the Ronin. Do you hate yourself? Get Ass Creed Shadows. Hehe, that's a joke. I've not played it. Looks bad though. Also worth pointing out that of the three, Rise of the Ronin is the only one with co-op, not including that extra DLC multiplayer mode they did for Ghost of Tsushima. In summary though, if you like the setting, or Team Ninja games, this is worth grabbing. If you just want a good open world game, there are better ones out there, overall. Maybe you've played them all already. Well, then get Rise of the Ronin too. At any rate, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Ciao.